the design argument. This argument is a proof that uses inductive reasoning. In order to understand the argument, you need to understand the type of proof that it is. Inductive reasoning is a form of proof or a conclusion that comes based on previous experience. It's reasoning that uses premises in the proof which don't necessarily prove the conclusion to be true. Now, you can accept the premises as true, and you don't have to agree with the conclusion. So there are aspects of the argument which you might agree with somebody on, but the final result of that argument, the conclusion itself, does not have to be accepted. And this is the opposite of deductive reasoning, which is something we'll be looking at in a later lecture, the ontological argument. And that's when, if you accept the premises to be true, then the conclusion follows to be true. It's necessarily true. So the design argument that we're looking at here is based on the following inductive premises reasoning. And so here's a classic breakdown of the argument. The first premise, premise 1. Man-made things in the world have been created by a designer with a purpose in mind. An example that we're going to look at is the classic watch and watchmaker. Here is a t-shirt that has a designer behind it. Premise 2. The world looks as though it has been designed for a purpose because it works so well and it's got many intricate, complex parts. So shifting from man-made things to the world itself. And the conclusion is drawn that the world must have had a designer. This designer must have been God. Therefore, God exists. You can see there that it would be acceptable for everybody to assume premise 1 is true. You might agree on premise 2 that observable in the world is design and that it's complicated. It's not something you or I could create. But this conclusion that there must be a designer called God and God exists is not something that everyone is going to necessarily agree on. This argument uses a posteriori knowledge. You can see a picture there of the infamous Sherlock Holmes with his magnifying glass. That's because a posteriori is knowledge that relies on experience of the world and perception and interpretation of the design within it. And it's got an empirical basis. This is evidence drawn from this world that we live in using your 5 senses. The first of the design arguments that we're going to look at is the classic form by St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas wrote in his Summa Theologica the famous 3 ways that you might consider and be familiar with from the cosmological argument. But here it's his 5th way, which has a type of design argument. And in it he argues that everything seems to work towards a telos, an end goal, an end purpose. Now, these objects simply can't achieve this end goal or purpose by themselves, so they are guided by an intelligent being. Aquinas, famous for his analogies, as you'll see throughout the course in various topics, uses one here. The arrow is directed by the archer. Of course, the arrow can't simply find and navigate its way to the bullseye by itself. It needs an archer to guide and direct it. He also observed that order in this world simply cannot be self-explanatory. It can't explain itself because it lacks intelligence to do so, and it also cannot act with intelligence either. And so the explanation for this order working towards a telos, an end, must be explained by something else which is controlling it, and that must have intelligence. Well, what could that be? Aquinas says that this intelligent being must be God. Building upon Aquinas' design argument is William Paley, who's a key figure in this specification. Now, Paley's version of the design argument is actually a direct response to David Hume's criticism of Aquinas' argument, which we're going to come across in a moment. Paley famously uses the analogy of a watch, a pocket watch, and he says that both the watch and the world, when you compare them, show purpose and design. And these things have not come about by chance, random accident. Now, the watch, he says, has been designed to work towards a telos, an end, and it needs a designer to do that. And so Paley says that the world works together towards the end of existence of humans, and therefore it needs and it needed a designer. A third design argument, building upon Aquinas and Swinburne, is from British philosopher in the modern age, Richard Swinburne. Richard Swinburne argues that since we can find evidence of there being order in this world, he says it's more probable that God exists than that he does not exist. Remember, this is an inductive reasoning. And so, therefore, probability is at the heart of its conclusion. He's not giving any certainty that there is God, but he says it's a better explanation than any other. And that's because Richard Swinburne is open to the idea, taking a phrase here from Bertrand Russell in his famous radio debate with Copleston, which we see in the cosmological argument, that Richard Swinburne uses that idea, that phrase, that the universe could be a brute fact. It could be explained by science. But he says God is a better explanation for these things. And he does that through the cumulative argument. Now, this is a very straightforward idea that says something is more likely to be true if you build up enough evidence, you accumulate enough evidence. For Swinburne, there were 7 key pieces of evidence that he says make up his design argument. The first is that there is an existence of a universe. It's very clear that we are living in one. And the second is that you can observe order within that universe. The third is that we have consciousness, which is quite a complex thing, but it makes us unique. The fourth is that we have the capacity as humans to do good. Morality, for example. 5, that there is a distinctive pattern of history that we can look back on. 6, that there are some unexplainable things that seem to have happened, which people might refer to as miracles. And 7, he uses religious experience on top of those things to point to the existence of a higher being. Now, he puts forward the ideas as well of co-presence and regulation of succession. So he argues that the watch, taking Paley's analogy, is made up of lots of intricate smaller little parts, and they're all placed specifically within the mechanics of the watch by the watchmaker. This is called co-presence. And they work in such a way that in succession of movements, these parts cause the watch to function. And that's the regulations of succession. So all the little pieces and the parts come together, they work together, and there's a succession of movements that make them actually function, their end, their telos. Now Swinburne simply argues that the world is made up of lots of little moving parts, co-presents, which all work together to create a functional environment for life. A fourth design argument is Frtenant's argument. Tennant offers a slightly different form of the design argument. He says that there is a huge amount of beauty in this world when we look at it, and much of it is simply not necessary for our human life. But the reason for this beauty therefore cannot be explained by science because it doesn't seem to play a role in evolution, for our own existence, and therefore there must be a bigger, greater explanation outside of this universe for its beauty. Let's turn to the criticisms. David Hume, a Scottish philosopher in the 1700s, argues a number of points. There's about 6 points or so. And he critiques the fifth way of Aquinas specifically. The first criticism is causal fallacy. This is a logical fallacy, and for David Hume, he has a problem here with inductive reasoning. And he makes the point that we have incorrectly, or Aquinas in particular, has incorrectly concluded the cause of an event. The event is the design of the universe, the coming about of life, and Hume says that the cause of that doesn't make any logical association between the event and its supposed cause. So it's illogical to argue that the cause is God of this universe. His second criticism is that the analogy that Aquinas uses is weak. The idea of comparing the universe and the way it works to the way a machine works is unsound. For David Hume, the world is actually more analogous to a floating, vast vegetable. And he makes the point that vegetables grow themselves without the need for a designer. And so he posits the idea that maybe this universe doesn't have, after all, an intelligent designer. A third argument by Hume is that the cause is unknown, and it's not as straightforward as making the claim erroneously that there is a designer. He says there isn't a designer. It's an unknown cause. We can't make this claim. And part of that reason is because David Hume saw the idea of causation as something which is based purely on experience, and therefore it could be incorrect because your thoughts are subjective, and therefore you can't really prove the causality of something. It links a little bit to Immanuel Kant's idea that you don't have enough knowledge to make these claims and to understand God. A fourth criticism is the fallacy of composition. This is the idea that Aquinas' argument is based on a part of something and not the whole. He's only got a little piece of the puzzle to work with. He can't step back and see the whole picture. It's impossible to do so. Therefore, there's a great fallacy of composition here, composing the entire conclusion that God is the designer based on only seeing a small part of the universe. Later, with the cosmological argument, we see Bertrand Russell making this and developing this point further. For Hume, he concedes that this evidence of what we see in the world could point to a designer, but it doesn't tell us anything about who this designer might be. And so for Thomas Aquinas, a Catholic, arguing that this is the God of classical theism, for David Hume, there's nothing to suggest why it should be. It could be anything. And finally, the sixth critique by David Hume is anthropomorphism. This is a term that you'll be using at different various points in the course. Anthropomorphism, effectively the idea of attributing human characteristics to a god or an animal or an object, in this case attributing human characteristics to God. David Hume says that people do this often for intellectual reasons, to make sense of something mysterious. But he critiques Aquinas' use of analogy here and says that you don't know enough about something like God, so it's impossible to liken him to something that you can observe of this world, and therefore you do the concept of God and injustice, and it doesn't actually work as an analogy anymore because it's flawed heavily, effectively arguing that it's futile to compare things of this world with something that is supposedly sitting outside of this world. Some other criticisms come from these three people here. First, you should be familiar with, from your ethics branch of the course, John Stuart Mill, which you discuss in utilitarianism. Now, he points out that there's a big problem with arguing for a good designer, an intelligent designer like God, because when you look at the random chaos of suffering and evil that exists in the world and you observe that, suddenly there doesn't seem to be such a good designer after all. Then there's Charles Darwin, the famous author of evolution theory, and he posits his theory of evolution, which can be used as a viable alternative to how life has appeared in such a complicated state. And this would be an alternative to arguing that there is a designer called God, an intelligent designer. And finally, the famous Oxford professor, Richard Dawkins, and he is a proponent of evolution, and building upon Charles Darwin, argues that there is no God. And he says there are flaws in this world, because if there were a watchmaker, then he must be blind to have designed this.